So that's just a fact. That's the way it is. But when you come to the contemplative level of Judaism into the Kabbalah, Islam into Sufi, multiple schools of Hinduism are very profoundly contemplative. When you go away from organized religion, institutional religion, blind allegiance to dogma, when you're going to an experience, and this is above all the contemplative. So we have these great contemplatives throughout history, East and West, starting out with very different institutions, worldviews, and so forth, but they start going down, deeper, deeper, deeper into experience. Here is the question that really seemed to be pivotal for me, and it ran that whole year, and that is when we look into the greatest depths of experience, insights of the great contemplative tradition, great contemplatives, East and West, are there assertions about the nature of reality, ultimate reality? Do we find a greater and greater similarity the deeper they go, or are they simply going parallel, kind of irrelevant to each other? Or the more deeply you go into, let's say, Christian and Buddhist contemplative practice, do they really seem to diverge and say more and more radically different things? So it's kind of a geometrical quality. Do they converge, diverge, or are they simply irrelevant to each other? In other words, basically just meditating in order to reinforce the doctrine that you learned in the first place. Right? And so that was my geometrical question. When you go to the greatest steps, where are they going? And I felt if they're just going parallel, then they're just brainwashing themselves. They're simply learning to experience what they already believed. Who cares? If they're diverging, all the more so. But if, with all of the differences among the doctrines of the world's religions, and they certainly are very significant, as they go deeper and deeper into experience, if they are in fact converging in terms of their experiential reports on what they're experiencing about the nature of consciousness, the nature of reality at large, if their reports seem to be getting more and more similar the deeper they go, then my working hypothesis then and now is, if that's the case, they are converging on the most important truths that human beings have any access to, and this is worth every sacrifice.
Okay.
And I was willing to make any sacrifice, and by the time I came to the end of that year, I read one book that was almost like the last straw, or the straw that breaks the camel's back and so forth. That is, it kind of decided it for me. And that was a book by Aldous Huxley called The Perennial Philosophy. And he laid it out, what I was seeking on my own, and he pointed out from my perspective, based upon months and months of research of my own, that they really do converge. And so by the end of that year in Göttingen, it was clear to me, I'm now willing to make any sacrifice necessary to devote my whole life to the pursuit of that truth upon which the great contemplative traditions are converging.
So you then bought a one-way ticket to India. You sold everything, I think.
I sold everything well, basically, I had a whole camera gear. I was pretty, how do you say, serious photographer.
Yeah.
I sold my whole camera gear to buy a one-way ticket to India. And basically, now we're at the burning bridges point, because I'm leaving academia.
Yeah.
My parents, as you can imagine, were not thrilled about what I was doing. And so, but I had really found something now. This ultimately makes sense. This is worth any sacrifice.
This is really pulling you, isn't it?
This is it.
Nothing you can do about it.
And there's nothing you can do about it. So some of my friends or people I've met over the years said, oh, that was very courageous. How bold. That took a lot of daring.
Yeah.
And that was never my sense. That was never my sense. If you're standing on a cliff and the ocean is maybe 30 feet below and a tiger is running towards you, you don't need much courage to jump off the cliff. You just have to figure, I don't know how deep the water is. Maybe I'll break both legs. But if I stay here, I'm going to be lunch.
Yes.
And if I had just stayed where I was, I felt I would have been lunch.
Okay, so you got to India, and another very intense time started. You kind of increased your application and learning of the Tibetan language, and I think you started after a time to translate from Tibetan into English, so you could understand teachings better. Yeah.
Well, I got there, and I was just greeted so graciously. I wound up being invited to stay at the home of the personal physician of the Dalai Lama.
Right.
And no one there spoke English. So, and I wanted to learn Tibetan, so what more can you ask? Quite early on, I found a wonderful teacher. I taught him English, he taught me Tibetan, and so that worked very, very well. And then the recently opened Library of Tibetan Works and Archives had begun. I entered there, was taking classes on Buddhism 6 days a week by a wonderful Lama, Tibetan scholar and contemplative. And then very soon on, I met with His Holiness Dalai Lama. And frankly, spiritually speaking, that was love at first sight. As soon as I met him, he was only, I think, 36 at the time, and I was 21. But I met him, and that was, frankly, I had very, very, very few expectations. I thought he was simply a king and a figurehead. You know, I had no idea. But I met him, and all of those notions just faded right out. And so from 1971, when I was 21...
So you had a rapport with him straight up?
Yes, and just a deep sense of his wisdom, of his profound kindness and compassion, his utter humility, and warmth and kindness. He really he touched my heart.
Right.
And since 1979, I've translated for him on many occasions. He ordained me as a Buddhist monk in 1975. And so it's been a personal relationship. I see him once or twice, 3 times every year still. But for those 4 years then, I was there in India, in Dharamsala, India, where the Dalai Lama lived, from 71 to 75. That was a time of total immersion. And so after I'd been there for a year and a half, I was quite fluent. I could read, I could speak. When I'd been there for a year and a half, I entered a monastery. I took novice ordination in 73, immersed myself in traditional, classic Tibetan monastic education. And so I lived there from 71 to 75, and just met with uttermost generosity by the Tibetan community, and they were a refugee community. I arrived in 71. Most of them had been in India for no more than 12 years, because the Tibetans, the Great Uprising of March 10th, 1959, took place 12 years earlier. So I was really literally living in a refugee community. And it was tough. Physically, it was very difficult. I got sick many, many times. So physically, great hardship. But living with the Tibetans as a whole in that community, something that really struck me was that I had, I must say by all standards, from any perspective, I'd had a very nice upbringing. Loving parents, very ethical, I had an excellent education, it was even transatlantic, and so I had really nothing to complain about, right? But living in this refugee community where everybody was dirt poor, and it was very primitive. I think there was one toilet for the whole town, and nobody wanted to use it because it smelled so badly. So it was very primitive, and our food was poor. Hygiene was terrible. There was a lot of illness. So this was not easy. But living with this refugee community, it was perfectly clear to me very early on, these are the happiest people I've ever met.
It's interesting, isn't it?
That was interesting.
Yeah.
And one can say, well, what on earth do you have to be happy about?
Yeah.
You had genocide.
This must have been a real eye-opener for you, this.
It was.
The fact they had this poverty,
yes,
and yet they're happy.
And it's not only poverty, but these people had been traumatized.
Yeah, they've been thrown out of their country.
Well, there was genocide in Tibet. By international standards, it was genocide. Almost every single one of them has some tale of woe to report about how they escaped from Tibet at the risk of their lives. All of them had lost loved ones, lost their homeland, lost almost all their possessions. So it wasn't just they were poor, but they'd lost everything. And with all of that, one can imagine they could be filled with bitterness, resentment, hostility, wanting to move towards terrorism. I mean, many natural human inclinations might arise. And that was all quite absent. I'm not saying it was utopian by any means. But to find such warmth and kindness and happiness just struck me.
What did the happiness mean to you? So it meant that they didn't presumably have resentment and anger and violence. I presume they were accepting. These are things that come up for me when I think of someone being happy. Yeah.
Well, of course, to make any generalization, there will be some exceptions. But we have our leaders, we have our idols, we have our celebrities in the modern West. We have rock stars, we have athletes and so forth and so on that many people look up to, right? In Tibet, they didn't have athletes or rock stars or musicians and so forth to look up to as that's the person I really want to be like. They really had largely one type of person that were the ideals for the culture as a whole. These were their lamas. And the lamas
so these were the role models then?
These were their role models. And here I can say with a lot of confidence, all of the lamas, with no exceptions, they all said, if we turn towards resentment, hostility, self-pity, and so forth, that is an absolutely downward spiral. No good will come from it. We simply have to recognize...
So it's intelligent leadership, in
effect. It was intelligent, but compassionate and wise leadership. And so but this is uniform. This was not one political party versus another. This was uniform. All the lamas said,